Hey, Bob, none of us can hear you. You're muted.
All right. Well, that should work better then. Welcome. Can you hear me now? Just now.
Bob, this is Chris. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
All right. I had a really good explanation. None of you heard that? Darn it. All right. Welcome.
I can hear you now.
Okay. I know you can. All right. I figured out my technological issues here. So this is a Zoom program that allows us to send chat messages. If you have a question during our presentation this evening of the auxiliary introduction to marine safety, environmental protection, go ahead and send it to me. I'm the MC here, or I'm the host with the mostest or whatever. And if it's something that I think Chris needs to stop and address, I'll say, hey, Chris, would you talk about this? But if it's something like a little housekeeping item that I can answer without distracting him, that's what we'll do. It'll keep the class floating. We got 48 people. Welcome, everyone. I am recording this session at this time, and I'm going to send everyone the Zoom link. So if something you didn't really hear real clearly, I'll send you the link. You can watch it again if you want. One good suggestion was if you would all, except for Chris, obviously, go ahead and turn off your cameras to help us with the bandwidth. I don't know if this is an old wives' tale or not, or old husband's tale, but it's possible that we will be able to operate more smoothly if we don't have a bunch of microphones on. Like Mike, I don't know if you can turn off your mute yourself. So everybody go ahead and mute yourself. We'll get started here. This is chapter 1 and 2. Chapter 1's fairly short. There's 13 chapters in the test, or in the course. And after that, we're going to give you a quick explanation on how to take the final exam. The acronyms should mostly be explained in your book. I just got a text question about that. And if you find something in your book and you can't flip back a couple pages and find out what it is, then go ahead and send me an email and we'll figure that out. Right now, we're recording this video so you can watch it again. Our first presenter from the United States Army, or retired from the United States Army, is Chris Strahlman. Chris, just tell me when you're ready for me to advance it, and I will advance it.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Like Bob said, my name is Chris Strahlman, and I am the DSO MS for 9th District West. And what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, chapter 1 is basically, as most of you have seen, you've read through, I'm sure you've copiously been reading through all of your reading and things. Chapter 1 is basically, we're just going to go over some things about the course in its whole, its entirety, some of our objectives, some of the things that we need to learn throughout the course, some little tips and clues and things like that. We'll get through that. We'll have a quick quiz at the end of the chapter, like we do at every chapter. And we will go on to chapter 2 there. We'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of the things we're going to talk about for the chapter 2, for the first chapter of the IMSEP class that we're giving. Next slide, Bob. Okay, so this is the Auxiliary Introduction Marine Safety Environmental Protection Program, and I will say, and I know Bob has said this before in some emails, is that we've developed this course. There was no course like this out there that we could find. There was no PowerPoints. We had to develop the PowerPoints. We had to develop the questions and everything like that. The instructors that you'll have over the next 5 or 6 weeks, as you can see there, are some of the 9th District Division SOs for marine safety. I will tell you this. I've been the DSO for about 4 months now. These guys that are going to follow me on have forgotten more. Most of them have forgotten more about marine safety than I will know. So you're going to get some great classes from them. They're very knowledgeable. And then, of course, Bob Allen is our member training from the district, and he put all this together. So I just want to give credit where credit's due now up in the beginning for this. But this is the introduction to marine safety and environmental protection. And you guys are kind of our beta class for this, and how this is going to go and how we're going to teach this and how National is going to take a look at it. Next slide, please, Bob. So as I said, this is the chapter 1 outline, pretty easy, quick introduction that I gave you. We're going to talk about some learning objectives. We'll do the chapter review questions, and I'll give you some of my own experiences for the end of course exam like this. A lot of you may have a lot more experience than I do. I'm taking these tests and things like that, so you know. But there's some tips and clues and some planning you can do to take the end of the course exam. Next slide, please. Okay, so this course, as it says there, it's designed for the total Coast Guard team, active duty, reserve, auxiliary, and then some of our civil service shipmates. You will be required to have access to the internet. It's an open book test at the end. It would behoove you to have you'll have to have access to the internet when you take the test at the end of the course. And it would help you a lot if you can learn how to open up different windows. You know, have the test open in one window, have your reference material opened up in another window, because you're going to have to look for some answers and things like this. Here are the basic websites that you'll have to have access to. And I will tell you in my opinion, you need to have all of them. But the three most important ones are the P Directorate Auxiliary website, the CFR, Code of Federal Regulations website, and the DCMS or Marine Support US Coast Guard.mil website. You'll get information from all of them, but those are the three where you'll make your money on those three websites. But you're going to go to all of them. So that's where you are. You'll use all of those in the final exam. And then we're all here to help you if you need help with that. But those are the things. There's a lot of embedded reading to do in this course. You'll need to do other reading and other research beyond what we're talking about here in these Friday evening classes that we're all having fun and spending together. Next slide, please, Bob. So here's some of the course learning objectives. I'll go through them. You know, we're going to equate you to student with the history and organization of the marine safety and environmental protection functions of the Coast Guard. We'll provide you an overview of the organization and content of the Coast Guard Marine Safety and Environmental Protection programs. We're going to provide the student with the basic working knowledge of the Marine Safety Manual and the Code of Federal Regulations. The Marine Safety Manual and the Code of Federal Regulations are going to be your go-to references for the important information that you have when you're looking it up. Those should be the first places you look for information that you need to look up. We're going to provide you with the basic educational components for members working towards qualifications in the Marine Safety and Environmental Protection Program. And it's the first step in qualifications for the Marine Safety and Training Ribbon and Marine Safety insignia. You might want to remember that. It is the first step in the qualifications for Marine Safety Training Ribbon and the Marine Safety insignia. And it will also satisfy member basic education requirements in Marine Safety and Environmental Protection, and provide for member recognition and, of course, continuing educational credits with the Coast Guard Auxiliary. Next slide, please. Okay, this is very important. You need to answer all the questions at the end of each chapter. And the course recommends that you don't even attempt to take the final exam until you can answer 90% of those questions, do the research to find those questions and things like that. Now, what I will tell you, what I will do is when we go to the questions at the end of the chapters that I teach, that's when I would be taking notes and looking at those answers and remembering the answers of the things we talk about. That will help you immensely if you have those references with you when you go to take the final exam. The final exam is open book, and when you go to take, it's not proctored, so when you go to take the final exam, if you're going to pay attention to anything in this course, these chapters, pay attention to the questions at the end of each chapter that we go over. And please remember to score a 90% on the end of chapter quizzes. Next slide, please. Okay, so that being said, this is a moving target. I will tell you, the first question is, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read the question. We're not going to have a lot of back and forth on this one, and then we'll have Bob put up the answers so you know. And you might want to remember these. Introduction to Marine Safety course serves as the first step in meeting the qualifications for the, Bob, the answer please, the Auxiliary Marine Safety Device, the Auxiliary Marine Safety Device. The Auxiliary P Department, Prevention Marine Safety Department, is organized into 5 divisions except the following. There is no Marine Transportation Security and Marine Domain Awareness divisions in the P Directorate. Third question, what should review question success rates be before students attempts the IMSP final exam? 90% pass rate. 90%. Now, this last question, of course, we couldn't get it to go along with everybody else and hide it and then come up. But what historical knowledge will students gain with this course? The Coast Guard Marine Safety and Environmental Protection programs, you'll have a historical knowledge of those programs and those missions and things of that nature. So you may see those questions again, maybe in the final exam. You never know. So I would go ahead and remember those. We'll give you a few minutes. Bob, you want to go to the next slide, or you want to give them a few minutes? Okay. So are there any show-stopping questions that anybody's put up for chapter 1? So the next chapter, any show-stopping questions? Okay. So the next chapter, that was pretty easy, and that'll be the easiest chapter we do in this course. The next chapter we're going to talk is chapter 2. And we're going to take a break a little way through this because we're going to get into a lot of minutia and stuff in chapter 2. And I don't want to drive you all crazy on a Friday night. So we're going to take a little break, probably 45 minutes into this. The next chapter is chapter 2. And we're going to talk about certain things like the Coast Guard mission, the Coast Guard structure, and an overview of the Marine Safety course. So we're going to talk, first thing we're going to talk about, Bob, next slide, we'll go into the Coast Guard missions. So outline, I'm sorry, I missed my slides up. Outline is we have the Coast Guard mission and structure, Coast Guard mission and structure, Marine Safety regulations and enforcement, the Marine Safety program, the Marine Inspection program, Port Safety and Security program, and the Port Safety and Security program evaluation and management program. And those are the 6 items or 6 tangents we're going to talk about in chapter 2. Next slide, please. So here we have the Coast Guard mission. The Coast Guard has 5 primary missions, and they are the federal agency charged with maritime safety, maritime security, maritime mobility, with an additional 2 missions of national defense and protection of national resources. And these 5 missions are all supported by numerous programs that we'll talk about each of these programs that a little more in depth. But each of these missions is supported by different programs in the Coast Guard Auxiliary. In the Coast Guard as a whole. And you'll see what I mean when I say as a whole, because all sectors, all types, all of us, the auxiliaries, reserve, the active duty, and civilian, take part in these missions and these programs. Next slide, please. So here's some pictorial display of some of the missions we do. Environmental protection on the lower right there. We have an icebreaker too, and that might be Arctic icebreaking or Great Lakes icebreaking. We have one of our missions here for interdiction of it appears to be migrants. We'll talk a little bit about that. We may have a port security there or a law enforcement mission there. Those are just pictorials of some of the missions and programs that the Coast Guard Auxiliary has. The Coast Guard Auxiliary, excuse me, the Coast Guard as a whole, Team Coast Guard has. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first mission we're going to talk about is the Marine Safety mission, saving lives and protecting property. This is our sexy mission. This is the one we see on television. This is the one we all like to read about and do. And some of the programs that support the Marine Safety mission are, of course, the Marine Safety program, search and rescue or SAR missions, recreational boater safety, huge auxiliary mission. I'm assuming most of us are in the auxiliary, passenger vessel safety, International Ice Patrol, think the Polar Star, think the North and South Pole, and port security. Those are the programs that support the Maritime Safety Mission. Maritime Safety Mission is one of the 5 missions that the Coast Guard is tasked by the federal government to complete. And the nexus of those missions are saving lives and protecting property. Next slide, please. So then we have the Maritime Security mission. This is mission number 2, and there's no order or hierarchy in these 5 missions. This is mission number 2, and this is establishing and maintaining a secure maritime system while facilitating its use for the national good. Nice flowery comments on what it is. And some of the programs that we look into is illegal drug interdiction. As you can see there in the photo, that appears to be some Coast Guardsmen and maybe a cartel submarine bringing drugs in. Alien migrant interdiction, very applicable subject now. Alien migrant interdiction. Our friends and our shipmates down in District 7. We'll talk about the districts a little later. That's a very active program for them, especially the active duty guys. Alien migrant interdiction, EEZ and living marine resources. EEZ, for those of you that don't know, that stands for Exclusion Economic Zone. And this is a zone where the U.S. and other coastal nations have jurisdiction over national resources, okay? EEZ and living marine resources, that's another program. General Maritime Law, okay? And law and treaty enforcement. And we'll talk a little bit about the Coast Guard. We're signatories on many treaties, many international maritime treaties, and we're also tasked with enforcing those international maritime treaties, as well as general maritime law that we enforce also. So that's the second of our great 5 great missions, Maritime Security Mission, establishing and maintaining a secure maritime system while facilitating its use for national good. Next slide, please. Okay, Maritime Mobility Mission, very, very important. Maintaining navigable areas and sea lanes, aids to navigation, whether they're private aids to navigation or federal aids to navigation. Ice breaking, very, very important to keep those sea lanes open. Ice breaking. We have a lot. I'm in Chicago right now, and the Mackinac does a lot of ice breaking on the Great Lakes. Vessel traffic services. The purpose of vessel traffic services is to promote active monitoring and navigation advice for vessels, in particularly confined and busy waterways. So in these busy waterways, the south end of Lake Michigan, and the Atlantic Ocean, and the ports and things like that, and the deep water ports and things like that, our vessel traffic services, there's a lot of vessels in a confined space, and they manage all that. The Coast Guard, that's one of our programs in the Maritime Mobility mission. They manage all that. We have 12 vessel traffic safety centers managing all of the traffic, maritime traffic in confined spaces around the United States. Bridge administration. A lot of people don't realize this. Any navigable waterway with a bridge over it, the Coast Guard administers to that bridge. And I will tell you this, in the town I live in, about 25 miles outside of Chicago, we have a navigable canal that runs through our town, and the town had to change a bridge, wanted the bridge adjusted, had to build it to put a walkway on the bridge basically, so that people could walk across. And the town had to get the Coast Guard in, amongst many other federal and state agencies, to sign off on that. Bridge administration is a big Coast Guard program, and then rules of the road, publishing rules of the road, things like that, navigation, marine navigation, things of those nature. So that's the third of our missions, Maritime Mobility Mission, maintaining navigable areas and sea lanes. Next slide, please. National Defense Mission, some things we talk about, general defense duties, maritime intercept operations, deployed port and operations and security. I can speak a little bit to this with personal experience. One of my last active duty assignments in the U.S. Army is I was the operations officer for an organization called the U.S. Army Directorate of Emergency Services in Kuwait, little country in the Mideast. Kuwait has 2 ports there, 2 deep water ports, Kuwait Naval Base and the Port of Kuwait. And the Coast Guard sent a cutter and 45s and 29s to Kuwait, deployed them there for a long-term deployment. I believe it was like 6 months at a time, and they would deploy to those 2 ports for port operations and security at those 2 ports. So they provide that kind of support and program, and that's in general support of the national defense, the Department of Defense. That is not in support of the Department of Homeland Security. Peacetime engagements. We do a lot of peacetime engagements around the world with our Coast Guard. Our cutters, our security cutters, are all over the world. I'm going to show you a slide a little bit later about that. And then environmental defense with those EEZ zones and things along that nature. But that can be not as much of a national defense mission, but it is in there as a national defense mission because environmental defense is a strategic national asset for us, a strategic national mission. They also do things like, a couple other things is they'll do escorting. A picture I have up there is at our major submarine bases, the Coast Guard will be assigned missions, permanent missions of escorting the subs in and out of the ports, escorting major naval facilities in and out of the ports. You know, somebody asks a simple question. You'd think the Navy would defend themselves, you know, coming in and out, secure themselves coming in and out of the ports, but it's the age-old question. They can have the Coast Guard do it, then they don't have to pay for it, and they can fund something else. So they like the Coast Guard likes the mission. They like to have the Coast Guard do it. It's a win-win for everybody. Another national defense mission. I'm sorry, Bob. Next slide, please. Okay, then we have protection of natural resource mission, and that's managing the sustainable and effective use of its inland, coastal, and ocean water resources for the future. And this is a very important program that people don't think the Coast Guard has a lot to do with, but it does. It's a marine environmental science. It's living marine resource protection, foreign vessel inspections, marine pollution education, prevention, response, and enforcement, marine environmental protection. You know, some people might ask, you know, foreign vessel inspections, how is that a protection of national resources, foreign vessel inspections? Well, here in the Great Lakes, we have a lot of problems, or we had a lot of problems, we're working on it, with the introduction of invasive species by the discharge of ballast water from foreign vessels coming through the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Great Lakes. We'll talk about that later in the course. But that's a protection mission where the Coast Guard monitors and ensures that foreign vessels are not doing that under treaties we have and not introducing invasive species by the negligent discharge of ballast and water and things like that they have. So those are just some of the things, protection of natural resources, managing a sustainable and effective use of its inland, coastal, and ocean water resources for the future. So that, next slide, and that'll wrap up the major Coast Guard missions that we have. Were there any major questions on that? Any show-stopping questions that Bob did not answer for you? Okay, so those are the missions and the programs of the Coast Guard. So here's a Coast Guard structure. I mean, this is all really nice. This is big Coast Guard. This is the structure of the Coast Guard. What we're focusing on here is actually what's in there in the yellow. And actually what we're really going to focus on in the Coast Guard structure are those two bottom blocks, mission execution units, okay? Mission execution units. That's where the rubber meets the road, as we used to say in the Army with the Coast Guard. And we're going to talk a lot about that. We're going to talk about who those mission executors are and what they do. We'll talk a little bit about the districts and then the areas of that nature. So next slide, please, Bob. So here's a slide that was not even in the program that I just wanted to throw it up here. The Coast Guard has a global footprint all the time. Okay, for those of you that don't know, they are supporting the United States objectives. They are supporting treaties and things around the world. The Coast Guard has a robust international presence, including 3 permanent international units. Patrol Forces Southwest Asia is the Coast Guard's largest unit outside the United States. Patrol Forces Southwest Asia is currently supporting U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet in Operation Freedom Sentinel. The Coast Guard has 2 commands, Activities Europe and Activities Far East, permanent, that support the Coast Guard's maritime safety and security mission, conducting marine inspection, marine investigation, and international port security operations to ensure the integrity of the marine transportation system. The Coast Guard also has personnel assigned to 9 DoD combatant commands worldwide and often has a presence on all 7 continents and all of the world's oceans, projecting national sovereignty with our icebreakers, national security cutters, aviation assets, and deployable specialized forces. So my own personal experience was when I was in Kuwait and the Coast Guard came there to save me because I was in the Army, they were actually assigned to U.S. CENTCOM there. That's a combatant command. And they were a Coast Guard cutter and support crew and vessels assigned to CENTCOM to support Kuwait. in that area of operation. So this just gives you won't be tested on this. There's no questions on this, but this just gives you an idea of Coast Guard course concentrations and things like that around the world. Next slide, please. So more familiar to us, this is how the Coast Guard big picture breaks down in what we call CONUS, or the continental United States, and then of course Alaska and Hawaii. The Coast Guard, as we all know, is divided up into two areas, two area commands, the Atlantic area and the Pacific area. The areas are further divided into 9 district commands. The Atlantic area includes 5 district commands covering the eastern United States, the Atlantic Ocean, the Great Lakes, and the Gulf of Mexico. The Pacific area includes 4 district commands covering the western United States and the Pacific Ocean, which is a huge area. So basically we've got 13, 11, 17, and 14 in the Pacific, and then 8, 9, 5, 7, and 1 in the, and then their derivatives in the Atlantic area. And that's how it's broken up into in the United States. Next slide, please, Bob. So here's the meat and potatoes. We take the districts are now broken down into sector commands. Okay, there are 37 sector commands in the U.S. Coast Guard right now, and they are divided. They are subordinate to the 5 districts. And as you can see in this slide, I won't read them all off to you, but those are the 37 sector commands, including Puerto Rico, Alaska, San Juan, and Sector Hawaii, Sector San Juan. There's 2 in Atlanta. There's Sector Juneau and Sector Alaska. There's Sector Guam, and then the ones contiguous around CONUS, as you can see. I myself I'm in Sector Lake Michigan. That's where Bob and I work out of. I'm sure all of you from around the country are from different sectors. I hope that you all know what sector you work for. If you don't, you need to ask your chain of management leadership what sector you're in. That's very important to know what sector you're in. But that's a depiction of the 37 sectors around the United States. Next slide, please, Bob. So as I've said, the sector command, that's the operational mission command. Divisions and areas, they don't do operational missions. What they really do is provide command and control and support the sectors. In 2006, all Coast Guard field units reorganized into sector commands, and they all have largely the same area of responsibility. Sectors are structured along process lines to manage the full range of operational, prevention, and response activity missions. Sector commanders are vested with all the same rights, responsibilities, duties, and authority of a group commander or a commanding officer of the Marine Safety Office. So they have this. They are basically sector commanders are 06 or captains. A sector is a shore-based operational unit of the United States Coast Guard. Each sector is responsible for the execution of all Coast Guard missions within its area of responsibility, with operational support from Coast Guard cutters and air stations. So not all sectors will all the time have a cutter or an air station. Sometimes they do have support. Sometimes they have permanent air stations assigned under their AOR. And you'll see in a schematic I show later that there's a little star next to the air station air safety officer, because some of them don't have it if they don't have air around it. Subordinate commands within a sector typically include stations, aid to navigation or ATON teams. Some sector commands also have subordinate units such as sector field offices, marine safety units that are responsible for mission execution in parts of the sector AOR. There are 37 sectors within the Coast Guard, and we're going to talk a little bit about all of those. I know I'm rushing through them a little bit. What I really need you to take away from this is the sector is the largest operational mission execution unit that we have. The sector. Next slide, please. Very important. Okay, the sector commander's mission. Everything derives from the sector commander's mission. So the sector commander is the captain of the port. Okay, he's a federal maritime security coordinator. He can be the federal on-scene coordinator for a national disaster or emergency as required by the National Contingency Plan. He is the sector officer in charge for all marine inspections, and he is the sector search and rescue mission coordinator. and he doesn't wear all those hats all the time when those missions come up. I would generally tell you that his major mission is the captain of the port. That's his major mission. He's also another large mission is Federal Maritime Security Coordinator. He is the search and rescue mission coordinator. Now, as the sector commander, is he down there actually coordinating that facility out in the middle of Lake Michigan or in the Pacific doing that search and rescue? No, he's got a staff that handles it for him. But the buck stops with him, as they say. The buck stops with him. A Coast Guard captain of the port is a Coast Guard officer who is responsible for enforcing regulations and providing direction to Coast Guard law enforcement within a specific area. The Coast Guard COTP or Coast Guard, the commander of the port's duties include safety and security, enforcing regulations for the protection of vessels, harbors, waterfront facilities, anchorages, security zones, safety zones, and regulated navigational areas, marine environmental protection, enforcing regulations for water pollution and ports and waterway safety, dangerous cargo, enforcing regulations for stowage, segregation, and documentation of bulk, containerized, or packaged dangerous cargoes, facility inspections, and conducting facility and container inspections, which require specialized training and qualifications. As you can see, his duties as captain of the port are large and expanding, and probably takes up 70% of his time, 60-70% of his time. That's his major duty mission. Next slide, please.
And that would be his or her. We had commander.
I'm sorry, you are correct, Bob. His or her, because our sector commander, yes, his or her.
She was outstanding.
Thank you very much. Okay, so all Coast Guard operational activities are either focused on prevention of an incident or illegal activity or response to mitigate the undesired effect of such incident. I have those two in red. You're going to see that throughout, and it's almost a philosophy. Prevention and response. We're preventing bad things from happening, and when they do happen, we respond to mitigate the effects of such an undesirable incident, no matter what that may be. If you remember anything else about these two chapters, remember prevention and response. Next slide, please. So some of the programs under the prevention doctrine are inspections, examination of vessels and waterfront facilities, investigation of marine casualties to determine the cause. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. There's been some changes with RBS and things like that, but we'll get into that. Develop and maintain waterway navigation infrastructure, ATON. I will tell you that I went on ATON patrol last week. I'm lucky enough to be crew qualified, and that comes down from sector. They shot it down to us through the station. What ATONs they want checked. They give us a list. We go out day and night and check those ATONs. Manage the marine traffic through vessel safety traffic systems. We talked about that, the VTS centers, and the use of captain of the port, limited access areas, and regulated navigational areas. And that's what that managed marine traffic is all about, is managing that marine traffic through limited or restricted areas. Next slide. Then we have, of course, we had prevention, and now we're going to talk about response. Search and rescue, that's the big one. Search and rescue and response. We want to save lives, okay? Marine environmental protection. We're talking about responding to oil spills, to monitor and supervise cleanup. Think about Deepwater Horizon. Right now, I work for Transportation Security Agency in my civilian job, and my boss is Mr. Pikowski, who, for those of you who don't know him, he was the Vice Commodore of the Coast Guard before he retired and joined the Transportation Security Agency as our senior and our lead administrator. And his biggest claim to fame, and what he did was he was down there at the Deepwater Horizon. Him and his team went down there, and he was the federal official in charge of the Deepwater Horizon, and he supervised the cleanup of that. Incident management, and then, of course, law enforcement. Those are our basic responses. We're responding to search and rescue. We're responding to environmental protection, oil spills, incident management, any major incident, and then law enforcement. Next slide, please. Okay, logistics is really, we don't talk about that with prevention and response, but logistics is the third pillar of the sector, supporting the prevention and response missions, as well as overseeing many internal missions that they have. So of course, the logistics, and when I show you, I'm going to show you a schematic in a little bit that'll show you all of this and makes it a little clear. You know, but logistics, of course, as you can imagine, they provide all the administration and personnel management for the sector command. They facilitate the naval and facilities engineering, think public works program that the sector might doing. They're in charge of the sector budget. If the sector has a medical center assigned to it or a medical clinic assigned to it, they would fall under the logistics section of the sector. And they also are responsible for sector and AOR tenant internal environmental compliance requirements. Basically what that is when they have Coast Guardsmen living in the AOR, there's certain environmental requirements that the Coast Guard has to ensure that their enlisted and officers are living in and things like that. And they're responsible to make sure, whether it's a government facility or a private facility, that Coast Guardsmen are living and working in the right environment. So that's logistics, very important. They support the prevention and response directorate. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the sector organization and how it's run. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the Sector Command Center. That provides supports and provides command and control for integrated operations within the response, prevention, and logistics sections of the sector. In the Sector Command Center would be the commander, the deputy sector commander, the command chief, the senior reserve officer, the flight safety officer, if they have flight responsibilities, the intelligence staff, the contingency planning staff. That's the staff that's going to go out when he has to respond to an oil spill or some disaster. They come up with the contingency plans for that. And then the auxiliary sector, the ASC, the auxiliary sector coordinator. So you know that in your sector, this is why it's important to know your sector. You know that in your sector, at the command level, there's an auxiliarist up there. And his voice is heard, and his voice is being heard more and more as we go along. Okay, so that's the Sector Command Center, and they basically run the sector. Then there's a few subordinate elements to it with different lines of command, and we'll talk about that. But sector field offices, sector field offices are a staff extension of the sector command, supporting response, prevention, logistics operations in the field, where distance and workload necessitate remote offices. Sector Lake Michigan is in Milwaukee. It's huge. Its AOR is huge. Okay, so they have they put a sector support office in Grand Haven, Michigan, on the other side of the lake from them, because their staff sitting up there in Milwaukee, it's not feasible for them to reach across the lake and manage and support those Coast Guard stations and everything on that side of the lake. So they have sector field offices. The one I'm familiar with at Sector Great Lake is Sector Field Office Grand Haven. I would suggest that when you find out your sectors, know where their field offices are. Know where their field offices are, because there's missions for auxiliaries there. So that's the Sector Field Office. Next slide, please. And then we're going to talk in, a lot of us know about it, Marine Safety Units, okay? Marine Safety Units are a commanded unit. It's not part of the staff. They work for the sector commander, but they have their own commander. He's usually a lieutenant commander, an 05, Marine Safety Units. And they're tasked with programs and missions of port security, marine inspections, environmental response, maritime investigations, and waterway management. So as it says here, some MSUs still retain captain of the port and federal on-scene coordinator for their AOR in the sector. I know MSU Chicago does. He has a huge responsibility, MSU Chicago, for the Southern Lake Michigan area and things of that nature. But those are MSUs. The one thing you need to remember about MSUs is, of course, their missions and their programs: port security, marine inspections, environmental response, maritime investigations, and waterway management. Is they are a command, okay? They are not an extension of the staff like a field office is, a sector field office is. They're their own command. They have a commander, a senior chief, and things like that there. So that's MSUs, Marine Safety Units. Next slide, please, Bob. And then we go down a little farther for marine safety units. We have marine safety detachments, and the marine safety detachments specialize in many of the same missions as MSUs, but they're smaller. Marine safety detachment personnel are not a commander themselves, but they're under the operational control of the sector prevention department. Marine safety detachment personnel perform maritime safety duties, marine environmental protection, and commercial vessel safety missions. The difference between them and a marine safety unit is, first of all, their AOR and their missions are smaller. And instead of working for a commander that's right there in the office with them, they work for the boss of the prevention unit up at the sector prevention unit, marine safety detachment. Next slide, please. So this is a pretty good detailed schematic of a sector. As you can see, you got the sector commander and all of his responsibilities. With a little asterisk is when needed, basically. He's always going to have a command chief. He's always going to have a sector auxiliary sector coordinator. He's always going to have a senior reserve officer, but he'll only have a flight safety officer if he's being supported or has aviation assets under him. As you can see, basically the deputy sector commander, he's either the alternate or the acting when the commander's not there. And on that staff is intelligence staff, contingency planning, and the sector command center, the actual TOC, Tactical Operations Center, as we call it. And then you have the three departments underneath that: logistics, response, and prevention department. And as you can see, there's asterisks there, like response. They only have it. Sometimes they don't have air ops underneath them. They do have the patrol boats and the stations. The prevention units have MSDs and then 8 MSUs. The MSUs are really, they get their direction from the prevention, but that MSU commander, he works directly for the sector command. As you can see under the logistics department, all the things, the admin and personnel things we talked about. But we also have finance, and then of course engineering support for aviation, naval facilities, public works, armory, environmental compliance, vehicles, all that kind of good stuff that they have there. That is, people don't think about it, but it keeps the sector running, and it's very important, and it keeps the down trace units running too. That's this detailed sector schematic. Next slide. Okay, I think we've been going a little bit here. Oh, I'm sorry. It's about 10:02. Do we want to take about a 5 or a 10 minute, a 5 minute, a 10 minute? Why don't we take a 10-minute break? And we'll get back to it. Bob, what do you think? You're the boss. Should I
How
try?
many more slides we got to go, Chris?
Pardon me?
We got quite a few
about
slides
20,
left.
20 something more slides.
Anybody put in the
Drive
chat if anybody wants a break. Yeah, let's just keep going if that's okay.
Well, break if you need a break, and we're going to drive through. Thank you, sir. That's why you're in charge. Okay, so now we're going to transition. We've talked about the missions, and we've talked about the organization of the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and we've talked about the programs that support them. And basically what we're going to talk about now is those programs. We're going to get pretty much in depth in these programs that we're talking about. So the Marine Safety Program, as all of you read, in the mid-1800s, Congress created the Steamboat Inspection Service. The service was created to preserve and protect the public from preventable marine incidents. At the time, it was basically steamboats. That's what it was created for, and it changed as vessels changed and things like that. There was a lot of damage. We're going to talk a little bit about that. The Protection Act set was carried out by federal maritime law enforcement. The preservation of life after a marine incident was carried out by the federal SAR forces. Prevention and response, right? Even back then, even back in the 1800s, they weren't using the exact same wordage, but they were thinking in that philosophy. Okay, the Coast Guard's current maritime safety program retained the overall philosophical objectives of both the prevention program and preservation of life. So there you go. The Steamboat Act of May 30, 1852 was passed as an attempt to protect passengers by preventing disasters caused by boiler explosions, fires, collisions, and that was passed in 1852. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Sultana tragedy. And I think it was like a driving force in this. It was a driving force in this. A little bit later on. Next slide, please. Okay, so marine safety program developed over the years. You have marine inspection, marine licensing, port safety and security, marine environmental response, marine transportation systems, recreational boater safety, big auxiliary mission, bridge administration. We've talked a little bit about these. These are the programs that support those sectors and all the missions and those MSUs and stuff they have. Next slide, please. Okay. The Marine Safety Office, in 1972, in order to consolidate marine safety policies, the Commandant consolidated the following programs into the Marine Safety Office. As you can see, commercial vessel safety program, port environmental safety program, marine environmental safety program, waterway management, recreational boater, and bridge. So those are all different programs hanging out in the Coast Guard, different people responsible. And in 1972, the Commandant being a very, very smart guy, so we have to consolidate this stuff. So we have, one boss, or it's controllable, it's manageable, and accountable. So we consolidated it into the Marine Safety Office. Next slide, please. Okay, did we get our slides mixed up here, Bob? I just want to make sure we did. Okay. Okay, go ahead. Next slide, please. Okay, all right, so RBS investigations. Okay, in 1982, RBS investigation policy was changed to reflect that only accidents that were inadequately investigated by the states would be investigated by the Marine Safety Office, as states are considered the primary investigative authority for all boating accidents per 33 CFR 17.4.103. It might behoove you to remember that Marine Safety Office states are considered the primary investigative authority for all boating accidents. It really might be, you might want to remember that. Next slide, please. Okay. Enforcement evolution. Over the years, different approaches to marine safety enforcement have evolved. Marine safety inspection and marine licensing program. So for the marine safety inspection and marine licensing program, a certificate of inspection, one of the enforcement would be withholding a certificate of inspection of a vessel, or a merchant mariner withholding their license. Okay, that was the hammer. That's what we did. For port safety and security, the Coast Guard went to a little different approach. Their more emphasis is not on punishment, but has been refocused on prevention. Okay, do you want to ask a licensing question, Bob?
Do I want to ask a licensing
Somebody's
question?
got a question in there for licensing. I'm sorry.
Yes,
It's Dave.
it's Dave Springer. I have a question, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, I have something that absolutely sticks up my craw, and I've been all the way up my chain of leadership except for the actual national directs. And my question is, why on God's green earth does the United States Coast Guard require a radio telegraph license in order to get a Coast Guard radio officer's license, especially considering that the United States Coast Guard turned off its last radio telegraph station long enough that the only people that might be left in the Coast Guard who ever used Morse code were maybe a couple of E9 reservists still hanging around.
Well, that's all you, Chris. I'm not jumping on this one.
Okay, so I would tell you, and quite frankly, you're asking me why. Okay.
Yes, sir.
I don't have an answer why. I can research that and have an answer for class next Friday. I would tell you my years. I have 35 years of experience in the federal government, both in the military and civilian. And I would tell you, because I would tell you the odds are they just haven't changed it yet. But if there's a reason for it, let me look it up. Give me a week to look it up. And I don't have an answer off the top of my head for you on that. Bob, do you have an answer for that?
No, Rebecca, you want to take a shot at that one?
Well, I think that's more the communications aspect of the licensing. So there might be some, probably in the comms course, one of the people who have that credential could answer that. But
Yeah, I have that credential.
yeah, so I I think that's beyond the scope of marine
This-
safety and environmental prevention is what I'm saying. So
Okay,
that's on the, yeah, that's on the communication end of the Coast Guard.
Good
okay,
answer.
thank you.
Becca. Good job.
So, getting back to that, getting back to marine safety. So we use both the hammer and the carrot and the stick, or however you want to look at it. There's multiple ways to do this, but for enforcement evolution, they're trying to go less on punishment and refocus on prevention of it for port safety and security issues. Next slide, please. Okay. So the Marine Safety Manual, the primary policy and procedural statements for the marine safety programs of the Coast Guard. This is a huge reference material for you. It's available on several of those websites. The course says there's 11 volumes of it right now. I don't know if the Coast Guard is using all 11 volumes. There were 11 volumes at one time. I don't know if they're using all 11 volumes or there's only 9. You can still access some of the volumes, but there were 11 at one time, and it prescribes the essential functions that must be performed to attain the objectives of marine inspection, marine licensing, port safety and security, marine environmental response, and certain RBS investigative functions when they need to take over investigations because they weren't done correctly by who? The states, remember that? But I would know definitely how to re-access the Marine Safety Manual and those volumes that are in there, because that is the go-to for, I mean, you couldn't teach that whole thing in this class. I mean, that would be a whole class to itself, all those volumes, but that is the reference material you go to, the go-to reference material, that in the CFR, in my opinion. Some other instructors might have other opinions, but Marine Safety Manual, and know how to access those on both of those. You can get it at the prevention website and then the Coast Guard website also. Next slide, please. So the Marine Inspection Program has 3 objectives. Okay, the Marine Inspection Program is to minimize the probability of a casualty or accident occurring to or on about a vessel. Does that sound like sort of like prevention to you? Those things we talk about, prevention, response. Minimize the effects of a casualty or accident and the probability of a vessel being lost or rendered useless as a result of that casualty or accident. And then maximize the probability of survival and rescue of personnel in the event of abandonment of the vessel becomes necessary. So those are the 3 objectives of the Marine Inspection Program. Minimize the probability of any casualty or accident, prevention, minimize the effects of the casualty or accident and the probability of vessel being lost or rendered useless, kind of prevention, and then of course response, maximize the probability of survival and rescue of the personnel in the event of an abandonment of a vessel becomes necessary. Next slide, please. So the Marine Inspection historical development, we're talking about Act of 1838 for the better security of life on steamboats. It's under the act was produced under the Secretary of the Treasury. The Act of 1852 improved the administration of the Act of 1838 and provided for licensing of pilots and engineers. And then post-Civil War, Congress repealed all provisions of maritime statutes and provided for steamboat inspection services. I would tell you through my reading, some of Rebecca and some of the smart people might know a little bit more than me, but those earlier acts in 38 and 52, those were almost like self-governing. They were almost like self-governing. And then in the 1860s, there was an accident, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, the Sultana disaster. And then following that, they repealed the previous maritime statutes and provided for a steamboat inspection service, which means it wasn't self-governing anymore. They were going to be inspected and things along that nature. Next slide, please. Okay, so I don't think this slide I may not have made it into yours, Bob. I'm sorry. I just want to talk a little bit about the Sultana disaster. I created a slide, and of course, with the mess we had tonight with mine, I didn't get it in. I just want to talk a little bit about it. The Sultana was a Civil War era steamboat contracted to move Union POWs in 1865 north from Confederate POW camps via the Mississippi River. On April 23rd, 1865, the Sultana docked in Vicksburg, Mississippi to address an issue with her leaky boilers, okay? So this is before the Steamboat Inspection Service. We still had the Act of 1838 and the Act of 1852 that was supposed to protect everybody from problems with steamboat boilers and other things, but it was almost self-governing. As a cost-cutting and time-saving measure, by her captain, the Sultana's damaged boilers were patched and not fully repaired to make the trip. He wanted to get out of there. If he was worried about money, he needed to get that steamboat out of there and get it north. And another incident that happened with it was the Sultana was designed to hold 376 passengers, but got underway transporting over 2,000 Union soldiers on the night of the disaster. That wasn't the captain of the Sultana that insisted upon that. He allowed it. That was the U.S. Army captain that was trying to get as many soldiers from POW camps out of the South as he could and get them north. So he insisted that 2,000 soldiers got on the Sultana, or he was going to break the contract. On April 27th, 1865, the overstrained boilers exploded, blowing apart the center of the boat and starting an uncontrollable fire, sinking the Sultana in the Mississippi River. Researchers indicated that of the 2,200 passengers, 1,195 passengers and crew perished, making the Sultana incident the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history. And then I did some other research, and other researchers will tell you that over 1,800 died. That, I believe, was the impetus for creating the Steamboat Inspection Service, because you just couldn't have captains out there ignoring the rules, ignoring the regulations for money. So that was the impetus of the Steamboat Inspection Service, which then becomes the incidents for the whole marine safety program in the Coast Guard. I'm off my soapbox now. I'll move on to the next slide, please, Bob. And I apologize for not getting that slide in there. Marine inspection, historical developments in the 20th century. In 1903, you had the Steamboat Inspection Service was transferred to the Department of Commerce. In 1936, it was renamed the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation, or BMIN. And then in 1942, the duties of the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation were transferred to the Coast Guard. The beginning and the development of federal maritime safety program arose from disasters that caused much death and injury and property loss. Experience showed the greatest casualties were caused by boiler explosions and by fire aboard a ship. As the steamboat industry grew, so did the general public's awareness of the need for maritime safety laws. The public's growing concern over these maritime incidents prompted Congress to begin to act to protect the public, beginning with the passing of the July 7th, 1838, to provide better security of the lives of passengers on steamboats. The law required owners and masters of vessels propelled in whole or in part by steam to obtain 2 certificates from appointed inspectors and provide 1 certificate to customs office, surveyor, or collector to obtain a license and to be registered. The inspectors were to be chosen and sworn into duty by their local district court judge. Inspections were required to be repeated 12 or 6 months as outlined. The reason I read that to you and didn't have that committed memory is there's a lot of space for abuse there. Had to come up with something else. So we ended up coming up with the Steamboat Inspection Service. Then it begat the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation, which begat the Coast Guard taking over all those inspection duties. Next slide, please. Okay. As we talked about previously, all regulations were developed by steamboats. The following regulations were aimed at specific classes of vessels. Motorboat Act of 1910, obviously for motors. Seamen's Act of 1915, the International Load Line Act of 1929, and the Great Lakes Load Line Act of 1935. For those of you that aren't mariners or crew and don't know what a load line is, the load line, also called a plimsoll, or low line is a reference mark located on the ship's hull that indicates the maximum depth to which the vessel may be safely immersed when loaded with cargo. In that time, they would try to get more cargo on the ship than the ship was designed to handle, pushing the ship lower in the water. Having those required load lines on there internationally or for the Great Lakes would tell inspectors and things of that nature basically if the ship was overloaded or not was a danger. Officers' competency certificates, that was enacted in 1936. Bridge-to-Bridge Radio Telephone Act of 1972, so that we could talk to each other, bridge-to-bridge requirements. International regulations for preventing collisions at sea, 1972 was also enacted. Next slide, please. An addendum or an update to the International Load Line Act of 73, the Inland Navigational Rules of 1980, Commercial Fishing Industry Vessel Acts of 83. These are all just add-ons, different things that need to be inspected, need to be regulated. Commercial Fishing Industry Vessel Safety Act of 88, Coast Guard Authorization Act of 1986, Oil Pollution Act of 1990. If any of you are going through and getting a MEAS or anything like that, you'll become very familiar with that. And the Maritime Transportation and Security Act of 2002, which was, of course, that's very important to remember that act, the Maritime Transportation Security Act of 2002, and that begat from, of course, the tragic events of 9/11. So those are different, expanding and evolving regulations of different kinds of vessels and requirements and things along that nature. Next slide, please. So marine safety oversight efforts that we have from the Coast Guard. Coast Guard regulations have incorporated the provisions of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS. The Safety at Life at Sea SOLAS Convention is an essential international maritime treaty that sets minimum safety standards for the construction, equipment, and operation of merchant ships. So now there's safety standards that we have incorporated into Coast Guard regulations for what they call the International Convention of Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS. Regulatory standards, navigation and shipping standards are published in Titles 33 and 46 of our ever-present Code and Federal Regulations, your second most important reference, covering the design and operation of inspected vessels and establish minimum requirements for uninspected vessels. And that's in the CFR Code of Federal Regulations, Title 33 and 46. Next slide, please. Okay. So types of inspection. Okay. There are numerous types of inspections, and they are all laid out in volume 2 of the Marine Safety Manual. I didn't want to, in this hour that we have here or so, I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole with that. That's one of those things, the type of inspections that you'll find in volume 2 of the Marine Safety Manual, because that is a rabbit hole we would go down, and it would take a while to do that. Next slide, please. Regulations and manning standards for crew qualifications. Vessel personnel qualifications fall into 2 major categories: licensed officers, masters, mates, engineers, pilots, staff, and radio officers. Licensed officers satisfy the various experience, physical, and testing requirements of regulations, are issued licenses that are renewed every 5 years. So those are your licensed officers. That's the first of the 2 major categories of your shipmates, basically, vessel personnel qualifications. Next slide, please. Regulations of manning standards of crew, unlicensed, ordinary seamen, members of the engineering department, wipers, which I have to look that up, stewards, lifeboatmen, and tankermen. These personnel are issued merchant marine documents that are endorsed with their qualifications and renewed every 5 years. Might be behoove you to remember every 5 years, renewed every 5 years for both of them. Every 5 years. Next slide, please. Okay. Marine investigations are covered under a variety of documents. 46 U.S. Code Chapter 63, 46 U.S. Code Chapter 61 and 63, 33 CFR 107-10-8. There you got CFR. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act of 53, Department of the Interior, Mineral Management Service, and of course, U.S. Coast Guard regulations. Those are the documents, the references that govern all marine investigations. I would highlight the 33 CFR 107-10A. And then the US codes also, chapter 63 and 61. Coast Guard regulations also. Port Safety and Security Program, part of the Marine Safety Program, the objectives. The objectives to the port safety and security are to prevent, detect, and control pollution by oil, hazards, substances, and refuge. Here we have that word, prevent again. To ensure the safety and security of vessels, facilities, structures, and persons on navigable waters of the U.S. and the outer continental shelf. Okay, so we're ensuring that vessels are safe and secure. We're assuring that facilities are and structures and persons on navigable waters are safe and secure by conducting our inspections and things along that nature. And that's the objectives of the Port Safety and Security Program, or PSS. Next slide, please. Okay, we have objectives and then we have goals. Okay, we have objectives and then we have goals. We'll go through some of the goals. One of the goals is, and just remember, for all of this, remember that sector commander, okay? He's, as part of the commander of the port, captain of the port, he has all these goals and responsibilities, okay? And the sector has those. Capability to respond to emergencies, enforce federal laws and regulations 100%, and captain of the port zones. Reduce spill rates during transfer operations of oil and hazardous material. We have to be able to manage that. The captain of the port has to be able to manage that when we're transferring oil and hazardous materials. Control the entry and movement of special interest SIVs in U.S. ports and waterways. Establish a downward trend in vessel casualties from unsafe cargo. Control access of personnel to U.S. ports. Not everybody can just walk into a U.S. port. We need to be able to control their accident. Reduce the incidence and magnitudes of fire, explosions, and serious casualties, and reduce pollution in the offshore environment. One highlight I'd like to mention here is the control entry and movement of special interest vessels in U.S. ports and waterways. That begat from 2001 and that 2002 act that we talked about earlier. And what that is this special interest vessels, and we're going to talk a little bit later about another one, is those are vessels that come from countries that might have elements that don't agree with the United States, and that those vessels that come in could possibly, not always, they have a reason to be here, cause harm. So they get a little more investigation, and they have to have a little more stringent authorization to enter U.S. ports and waterways. Okay, more stringent than our more comfortable allies that we have, and that's the special interest vessels. Next slide, please. Safeguard U.S. ports, waterways, port facilities, vessels, property, and person in the vicinity of those ports from accidental harm. Gather through harbor patrols, aerial reconnaissance. That sounds like mob missions to me, and other means information necessary to promote safety of vessels, ports, environments, surrounding communities, and offshore areas. Conduct import boarding of U.S. and foreign vessels to determine compliance. Okay, we have to be boarding these vessels. We have to be doing our inspections, making sure they're compliant. Those are all part of enforcement actions from port security. Set safety zones and control vessel movements. Okay, we have in the south end of Lake Michigan, around Chicago, we have safety zones all over. The Jardine water filtration plant on the coast of Chicago is the largest water filtration plant in the world. There's a safety zone around it. Issue captain of the port orders to protect the safety of personnel performing port operations, the facilities located in port, and the environment. I would remember the acronym captain of the port. Remember that acronym. You're not going to have to remember all of his responsibilities, but he has overarching responsibilities. Next slide, please. Okay. Continuing enforcement. Enforce the statutes, regulations, international agreements governing the safe handling, storage, and movement of hazardous cargoes on vessels and navigable waterways. Enforce statutes and regulations and international agreements. Okay, we enforce international agreements. Enforce the pollution prevention regulations under MARPOL 7378 for vessel operations, controls, and equipment. I'm going to read a little bit. MARPOL 7378 specifies tanker design features that are intended to minimize oil discharge into the ocean during ship operations and in case of accidents. It provides regulations with regard to the treatment of engine room bilge water for all large commercial vessels and ballast and tank cleaning waste. We talked a little bit about that earlier. Enforce pollution prevention regulations under MARPOL 7378. You might want to remember MARPOL 7378. I'm sure it will be discussed in later chapters. Monitor and enforce the permitted ocean dumping of chemicals, sewage, sludge, and dredge materials. So they're all the enforcement activities. We will take enforcement activities if we find out that people are not complying with MARPOL 7378 or any of the other regulations that they have out there for those type of things. Next slide.
And Chris, I just go back to that slide. I just want to
Please do, Rebecca.
So MARPOL means marine pollution. That's what it's short for.
Thank you.
So MARPOL is marine pollution.
Thank you very much. More enforcement activities, monitor and enforce requirements for ocean incineration operations, detain or deny entry to vessels who pose a significant safety threat to the port of environment. Okay, port or environment. That is the sector commander and his intelligence operations will tell us that. Okay, they need to detain or deny entry to vessels who pose a significant threat, whether it's for non-compliance with safety regulations or non-compliance with environmental regulations, or there's intelligence on this, there's actual intelligence on this, but that's what we talk about there. We're doing MSUs are doing inspection of waterfront facilities and enforce associated safety, cargo transfer, and pollution prevention regulations. Enforce the statutes and regulations, international agreements governing deep water ports, and enforce the statute and regulation governing offshore lighting activities. I will tell you that most of this is done by those MSUs and MSDs that are out there. If you're wondering who's doing all this, a lot of this port activity, a lot of these facility inspections, those are the MSUs and MSDs that are subordinate to the sector and subordinate to the prevention section of the sector, that they're out there, the boots on the ground doing those inspections. We have auxiliary unit coordinators assigned to Station Chicago. We have auxiliaries that work there and have certain qualifications that work there and do those inspections or assist in those inspections. So that's who's doing those inspections, the MSUs and MSDs and the enforcement activities. Yes,
we have
sir.
a couple more members in the class. You want to explain what lightering is?
Enforce the statute regulation governing offshore lightering activities.
So refueling. Yeah, it's refueling.
Refueling activities. I had to double check and make sure that wasn't a spelling error. That's what I was thinking about. Refueling activities. Not a word that we use very often. Thank you very much. Okay. Administer the special interest marine safety port security activities. We talked about earlier, administering the special interest vessel programs, knowing where these vessels are coming from, and are vessels coming from areas that there are however we're going to put this, people or philosophies that don't exactly align with U.S. and our philosophies here and want to cause damage. Responds to threats of acts of intentional damage, destruction, espionage, sabotage, or terrorism in U.S. ports, harbors, water safety. Establish and enforce security and safety zones. We talked about that. Develop and maintain emergency response plans for military readiness, port and vessel accidents of all types, counterterrorism, civil disturbance. That's another thing that sector commander has on his head. He has a staff there that's constantly developing contingency plans for all those things that he can put into effect if he needs to. Inspect facilities and ships for compliance with port security requirements. And that's all on the security side of the house. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we get down to evolution and management, and that is it's kind of a long term. What we used to have, initiated in 1977, was a Marine Safety Information System, or MSIS. It was used to identify vessels with repeated safety violations. In December of 2001, it was replaced with the Marine Information for Safety and Law Enforcement, more commonly known as the MISSIL. It replaced the outdated MIS system with a web-based system, and it incorporated the needs of both marine safety and law enforcement. The MISSIL is an information system that supports the information needs and business processes of marine safety, maritime security, environment protection, law enforcement, search and rescue, bridge administration activities of the U.S. Coast Guard. MISSIL allows for the U.S. Coast Guard to centralize information for many missions that previously was not accessible across programs. MISSIL contains information on individuals with established relationships and/or associations to vessels, facilities, including platforms, bridges, deep water ports, marinas, terminals, and factories, and related U.S. Coast Guard activities. So what they did was they put all their informational eggs in one basket, and they created a web-based missile system, which is still in use today, MISL, and it is very in depth in the information that it has on all of the marine safety areas and port safety areas and things of that nature. And it's very expansive, and it is used. I'm a watchstander, and we use it all the time. So, next slide, please. Okay, so we're down to about 21 hours. Here are some questions. I will tell you that some of these questions you will see again. First question, who or what is considered the primary investigative authority for all boating accidents? Many times we talk state. Bob, very good. In any apparent conflict between MSM and any state statute, the what shall be observed?
State.
State statute.
Legal
requirement.
requirement.
Legal requirements, and that's the way it's phrased in there. And I would tell you, quite frankly, that is following the state statutes. If you said state statutes, in context, you're right. But the test question is asking for legal requirements, and it's a military operation. You have to answer legal requirements. Next question, blank are intended to ascertain whether or not a vessel has been maintained in accordance with the proper criteria.
Inspections.
Logbook.
Schedule maintenance reviews. Schedule maintenance reviews. These might be ones you might want to be jotting down if you can take a quick note. The blank controls the licensing, documenting, and qualification of merchant mariners and seaman record keeping. This one you had to go into depth into the embedded reading to find the answer to this. The blank controls the licensing, documenting, and qualifications of merchant mariners. Anybody want to venture a guess? Go ahead, Bob. National Maritime Center. You really had to dig deep for that. And when that and just so you know, when that question comes up on your taking the test, and you have that computer there that you can go to another window, you can look that up. That's perfectly okay. What contains provisions for required minimal manning of an inspected vessel? A certificate of inspection. We couldn't get it to pop up blank. Certificate of inspection. So those are questions. There's 50 questions on this test. There's 6 chapters like this. So I don't know, Bob, if you want to talk a little bit about it, but those are the questions that will come up from the test. Bob, they're asking if we're going to give them a copy of the slides. You want to make a call on that?
We will give you a copy of this video. Everybody get a copy of this video. You can go over it again and write down anything you missed.
Thank you, sir.
So those are those are right. So any questions from the end of chapter 2? That was a lot of minutia. Bob, can you leave that slide back up there before we go on? Just so they can get it. Everybody's got it. The question slide.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
You were saying that we needed to do the end of the course or the end of the chapter tests.
Yes.
Mine doesn't have any end of the chapter tests.
Yeah, you have to flip over to the very back of the manual. It's all the way in the back.
appendixes.
So that's just one. I mean, that's the end of the course, ain't it?
No, you'll see if you read it, ma'am. You'll see there's questions, and they tell you what chapter each question is from.
Yeah, just flip over all the way in the back. It's page
It also
90.
gives you the answers there.
Yeah, page 97. You can see it tells you which ones come from which chapters.
Okay, but it's not like, I thought like chapter 2 had a set of questions after chapter 2. And then at the end, we had a bunch of different ones. Okay, sorry about that.
No questions. That's a good question. Don't be shy. Ask good questions. That's a good one.
I would tell you these questions on chapter 2. You might see those on the test. You might see those on the test.
I have a question. 9/11, that wasn't the event that caused all the agencies to start coordinating and making sure everybody was, knew the plan before it happened? Do you know if it was that? It wasn't that event. It was the event before that. What was that event? Do you know?
Well, I'm
Ma'am?
sure,
Go
I'm
ahead,
sure
Bob.
they had a role. Mhm.
Right. I will tell you from my experience, with 9/11, one of the biggest things at 9/11, the two big things at 9/11 we found out about ourselves in 9/11 was all of our federal agencies were not sharing information. They were
Okay,
not
it was 9/11 then.
was
Yeah,
9/11.
okay.
That's
That's
that they were not. The FBI was not sharing information with the Secret Service, and they were not sharing information with the ATF and that. The other thing we found out at a more local level is we couldn't talk to each other. In the city of Chicago, the Coast Guard, the fire department, and the police department were all using different radios and we couldn't talk to each other. And they had the same problem in New York. Local law enforcement couldn't talk to federal. So that was the two big things we found out from 9/11. We weren't sharing information, especially the federal agencies. And we could, at a local level, we couldn't talk to each other on radios. It was ridiculous. But so
that was it. Thank you very much.
Another good question. Anyone else? Good question.
Just a comment, 9/11 was also the impetus for the formation of Homeland Security, which brought all of those agencies together.
yes, absolutely right, Jim. Homeland Security was transportation. You know, the people that won't let you bring a bottle of water on the plane, the people I work for, that came out of 9/11 also. TSA came out of 9/11. The airlines were basically self-regulating their security before 9/11 because they were paying and hiring for the security people to run the checkpoints. And I'm not saying they did a bad job, but that begat TSA, whether you think that's good or bad. That begat TSA from 9/11. A lot of life changed at 9/11. I think we've forgotten about that since 20 years old, some odd years have gone by. So that finishes up chapter 2. For next week may be a little longer because they'll have 2 full chapters, where I was a little lucky. I only had a chapter and maybe an 8 to do. Chapter 1 was short. I had a lot of minutia to do, a lot of things like that. I hope you took something away from it. My goal is not to get you to memorize stuff out of this. Is it to understand where to go to understand big picture and where to go to get information and stuff like that. I wanted you to understand the big picture structure of the Coast Guard. I wanted you to understand that the sector is so very important because that's that level of operational that makes everything happen, not your districts, not your areas. I wanted you to understand the big programs of marine safety, not into the minutia yet. You have time to read about that and study that in your MSM and your Code of Federal Regulations and things of that nature. And I hope everybody kind of stayed awake. But besides that, that's all I have.
Great.
I took the bullet for the first one. So
No, you did
Thank
good.
you.
Let's go to Angie's question real quick. Go ahead, Angie.
I'm sorry.
Angie, you had a question. Go ahead. I can read off your question here. Or I can let you talk. Go ahead if you want to talk.
I was just wondering, you said you had the first set of questions. I didn't get it all the way written down. Could you go back to that so I can see?
You mean chapter 1?
Yes.
So the questions that are from chapter 1, do you have your book right there, Angie?
Yes.
Go ahead, open your book. I'll go to page 97. And you see how it says IMSEP Chapter 2, IMSEP Chapter 2, IMSEP Chapter 1? Those are the same questions. See there on page 97?
Yes.
What was that? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Angie.
Yes, I see them now.
Oh, good. Yeah, you know what? The first time I flipped through it, I didn't see it either, so no worries. Good question. Other good questions. Anyone else? I'm going to actually go around the room a little bit. Rebecca, do you have anything else you want to share?
Well, just to go back to Dave's question about the communication. So I think part of the reason why some of those that communication system is still being used is probably not because of the Coast Guard, but because of the Federal Communications Commission. So the FCC has some regulatory say about how communications are done. So it could be they just haven't gotten around to it like
Okay, now I can address
others are
that.
saying.
The FCC does still have the radio telegraph license, but they don't have any specification as to the requirement who has to have it, other than if you have a marine coast station, now that operated Morse code, you had to have that license. But the last Morse code listening station by the Coast Guard was turned off in like the 1980s, and I think it was the 1990s for any commercial station. So essentially, there is no one using Morse code today except for some ham radio operators, and it's optional for them.
Yeah, and it's probably just they haven't gotten around to making the changes for that. It's just like everything in government, sometimes it's just slow.
You know, it's
So-
it's hard to sit here and not have an answer, but I mean, I've seen stuff in my government service. I've seen stuff like that, and people are incredulous about that. But I mean, I've actually seen stuff like that. So it's a good default answer. It might be something to be researched and looked at and asked why. But
Good. No, thanks very much, Rebecca, for researching that. Chris, you want to touch base real quick? There were a couple questions about this for helping us pass the final exam. I thought you did a nice job explaining it, but go ahead.
so when you go to take the final exam, you know, it's 50 questions on the final exam. And they're going to ask questions where you need to be able to know the reference to go to. Okay. There's so much information here you couldn't memorize it. So you need to be able to go to these websites while you're taking the exam. The most important ones, I think, are the ECFR, Code of Federal Regulations, the P department, that's an auxiliary, P directorate, and then the DCMS, which is the Coast Guard Ever Marine Safety website. I actually think it's easier to get the marine safety manuals out of the P directorate than it is out of the DCMS, but you can Google them too. I mean, they're there, but you need to be, those are the three, and you're going to need to be able to, as you're taking the test, go and look that stuff up. It's not like you can memorize it. It's very, if anybody's taken the aviation B exam, I think it is. I took it. Bob, you've taken it, right? Or is it the first one you take? And I took it 5 times before I passed it, and you kept having to take looking stuff up, and there's little things you can do to help yourself and stuff like that. I would tell you this. I failed the aviation exam 5 times before I passed it. Don't feel bad if you're not. Some people will pass this right away. Some people will take a couple of times. It took me a couple of times to pass it when I took it. It's not, don't feel bad. You'll get the hang of looking things up while you're taking the test and stuff like that, and you'll all do great. I'm sure. Does that kind of answer the question that was asked out there? Or does anybody need me to expound a little more on it?
No, you hit the nail on the head. Good. Going around the room a little bit more. Jim Lubner, what other thoughts do you have on chapters 1 and 2? You there, Jim? Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yep, I just had to find the button to unmute. Sorry.
No worries.
No, Chris did a good job of covering a whole lot of material. My only comment is just I went back and looked up the definition of lightering. I mean, someone asked that question, and it's not just refueling. And this is why I went back and looked it up. I had another definition in mind. It actually involves the transfer of oil, fuel, hazardous material from one vessel to another, and it's often referring to actually taking cargo off of a larger ship and moving it in, either so that the larger ship is lighter and can come into a port, or because the larger ship is not going to get into a port, it's the port isn't deep enough. So they offload it offshore onto a barge or some smaller vessel and move it inshore then on a vessel. So it's a transfer of oil or hazardous material, fuel for that purpose, as much as it is two vessels refueling in the middle of the ocean. Both of those would fall under the same kind of a definition of lightering, just as a clarification of that term.
Excellent. Good job. Other thoughts? Any other thoughts?
Not at this point.
Is Dave Klein with us? He might have been here early and might have had to leave. Jay Katzman, other thoughts? You want to unmute yourself, Jay? I don't know if he can speak. Good. So I wanted to emphasize this here. Great job, Chris. And everybody, if you can get on the bottom of your computers and go over to reactions, let's all give Chris a thumbs up for his presentation here tonight. Let's all give him a thumbs up. You see where that is on the bottom? You can just scroll your thing down there. Great job. You look at this.
You guys are all being too kind.
No, great job, Chris.
I will tell you, there is one inalienable truth about teaching. If there's a word in there you don't know, somebody will ask you about it. And I wanted to make sure I talked about, Captain Report, define different things, and I didn't know that, and I didn't catch it, and I didn't define it, and I didn't look it up, and of course somebody asked about it. So I learned something new today.
Good. Well, you're getting a lot over in the chat. They're giving you wonderful compliments, Chris. And when I look at each volunteer for the Coast Guard Auxiliary on an average contributes about $10,000 to the benefit of the Coast Guard and the nation. So this class with 55 people in it, this is a $500,000 class. So this is a huge undertaking. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stop the recording, and if anybody wants to stay around for just a second, see if I can figure out how to stop the recording now. Here it is. Stop recording.